The automobile began to change from a novelty item for the wealthy into a viable transportation option for the ordinary citizen, thanks to the efforts of Henry Ford. Slowly but surely, the streets were becoming filled with noisy cars rather than horse drawn carriages. He conveniently leaves out smelly. There was a new enthusiasm in developing motorized vehicles as a means of transport for all. There were more than 8 million cars on the road by 1926, and by 1929, 45 million Americans were using cars as a means of to vacation across the country. The number of service stations would increase tenfold throughout the 1920s, along with roadside restaurants and motels. Los Angeles, California was the first major city to be built around the use of the car and helped to develop a car culture that would spread across the nation. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the car allowed families to escape the Dust Bowl by heading out west in search of a new life. The car was such an important part of American life that by the 1930s, citizens owned more cars than either telephones or bathtubs. The roads began to get paved and citizens were put to work, building bridges and tunnels to accommodate the intense growth of traffic on the roads. The 1939 World's Fair was centered largely around the automobile industry, with several major companies showing off their new innovations and advances. The start of the Second World War halted the progress of the car for a time, but not before Henry Ford revolutionized the industry. Henry Ford's early life and career. Henry Ford was born 30 July 1863 in Greenfield Township, Michigan. The son of farmers, he never completed the eighth grade, but from a young age, Henry showed a serious interest in the then modern study of mechanics. His parents supported his ambitions by constructing a workbench for him in the already cramped kitchen. Henry spent a lot of time at his workbench, tinkering and teaching himself all about how things worked. Life on the farm was very isolating to Ford, and this gave him a great perspective later in life on the need for affordable transportation for the common person and how the new idea of a horseless carriage could transform the world. Ford worked as a machinist throughout his 20s until he got the opportunity to work for Thomas Edison. Henry Ford began his career as an engineer for the Edison Illuminating Company in 1891, where he rose to the rank of chief engineer in 1893. It was during this time that Ford would experiment with gasoline engines and self propelled horseless carriages, such as the quadricycle. Ford eventually crossed paths with Edison himself in 1896 and was given encouragement to move forward with a second vehicle. Ford launched his quadricycle and tested it around Detroit on 4 June 1896. The horseless carriage featured 28-inch bicycle wheels, no brakes, and could reach top speeds of up to 20, as in 20 miles per hour. The quadricycle wasn't quite the vehicle Ford envisioned and had a few major flaws, such as the inability to go in a reverse and a propensity to overheat. Ford decided that it was time to branch out on his own, and on 5 August 1899, he founded the Detroit Automobile Company. He began to produce automobiles backed by Detroit lumber baron William H. Murphy. America had the railroads, but other transportation methods were terribly inconvenient. During this time, an automobile manufacturing boom hit the city, and over 50 more companies sprung up that same year, with more to follow the next year. The majority of these companies would inevitably fail. The Detroit Automobile Company produced cars for 2 years, but was ultimately unsuccessful. Ford attributed this to a poor quality product that was overpriced. Henry Ford was beginning to form a vision for the automobile industry, and it required him to have more control over all aspects of production. The next venture that Ford undertook was far more successful, but in order to attract backers, he had to do something bold. Ford built a race car in secret to help build publicity for himself. On 10 October 1901, Ford took on famous racing driver Alexander Winston in a one-on-one sweepstakes race. Ford had no money or reputation to hire a real driver, so he put himself behind the wheel. It was a risky venture, to be sure, but Henry Ford was never afraid to take the risks necessary to succeed. He also didn't fear for the potential failure. In fact, it seemed to drive him on. On the sixth lap, Ford closed the gap, and his rival's engine overheated. Ford won by nearly a mile. It was as a result of this spectacle that Ford was able to forge the Ford Motor Company. The journey started with Ford and Malcolmson Limited, which was a partnership he formed with coal dealer Alexander Y. Malcolmson. The two leased a factory and made a deal with the Dodge brothers, John and Horace, and Ford began work on designing his inexpensive automobile. After some shifting around of investors, the company would be rebranded on 16 June 1903 as the Ford Motor Company. Ford managed to get the then famous racing driver Barney Oldfield to drive his Ford 999 model across the country, which is what it took to get a brand recognized at the turn of the 20th century. Ford would also find good promotion in backing the early days of the Indianapolis 500 race in the coming years. The Ford Model N, as in Nelson, was introduced to the marketplace and sold for 2 years from 1906 for a price of $600. Today's price, well, 2016, I presume, $15,127, 2016 price. The relative success of this car emboldened Ford, and he went back to work, developing an even better model for the masses. Henry Ford was driven and sure of his own vision, but not everyone felt the same way. He duped backers by producing parts for cars he never intended to build. Ford used their money and time instead to work on perfecting his magnum opus, the Model T, as in Tango. He had no time for investors or their ideas. In fact, he blamed the investors for the past issues he had had. Ford harbored a hatred for the rich and for his own investors. In 1907, Henry Ford walled off a corner of his factory wide enough only for the chassis of a car. There was one door that remained locked at all times. Ford put his engineers and team in the secret room to have them develop a new suspension system and engine. Ford himself wasn't shy about getting his hands dirty and worked side by side with his men. His passion and drive took center stage. For above any position or prestige that he held at the time, it wasn't until later in life that his ego would inflate to a dangerous level. Ford kept introducing new car models into the marketplace. The Model K, as in kilo, was too heavy and expensive. The Model N, as in November, was lighter but had an engine in 4 pieces instead of one block. He kept working his way through the automobile alphabet, working towards the T, as in Tango, where he would finally realize his vision for the people's automobile, something that would connect the country and close the gaps in society. In October of 1908, after 2 years of intense development, the Ford Model T, as in Tango, would emerge. The car featured new innovations such as four-cylinder 20 horsepower engine, a much improved transmission, and a magnetic generator that powered the ignition and lights. The Model T also featured an open-top design at first with an optional add-on cover. The original color scheme of the model car was green, but that would soon change to only black. The Model T weighed 1,200 pounds and could reach speeds of up to 40 miles per hour. The old horse-drawn carriages could take up to 10 hours or more to travel 40 miles, so the mobility that the Model T offered was vastly improved. Wells Fargo and Company was one of the more well-known stagecoach companies that would transport people across the often dangerous territories, but even those could only travel an average of 5 miles per hour with teams of 4 to 6 horses.